Hi, is my camera focused about like you'd like it?
Yeah, I think that looks fine. All right, switching over. So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on Facebook. I'm just going to give everyone a minute or so to find the stream. So we'll just wait a second here to let people find us. All right, looks like we've got an audience now. So today we have Dr. Comer of VSU is going to talk a little bit about indoor gardening and gardening if you have limited space and not access to a large backyard space. And we have a very special guest as well who's going to introduce Dr. Comer. This is Dr. Ray McKinney, who's the Dean of the Virginia State University College of Agriculture and 1890 Extension Administrator. So he's going to talk a little bit about what his role is in VSU and Extension, and then he's going to introduce Dr. Comer. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McKinney.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Facebook Live session that is being brought to you by Virginia Cooperative Extension via Virginia State University's Extension program. Virginia Cooperative Extension is a partnership and collaboration of the Commonwealth's two land-grant universities. It is through this dynamic relationship that this dynamic relationship that undergirds the Commonwealth of Virginia agricultural and forest sectors. It's this relationship that allows us to continue to bring effective programming to you. During the COVID-19 pandemic, our researchers and extension specialists have been busy finding ways to continue to provide support and assistance to individuals, families, and communities. And today's presentation is yet another example of our commitment to you and your success, the stakeholder. So please relax and enjoy today's presentation that is going to be given by Dr. Marcus Comer. Again, we have with us Dr. Marcus Comer, the Extension Natural Resources Specialist at Virginia State University. Trained in the field of agricultural education, Dr. Comer has a multitude of interests, but in recent years has focused his attention on work relative to sustainable indoor food production systems. So without further delay, I would like to present to everyone Dr. Marcus Comer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleasure to be here with you this evening and to talk about some of my passions. Since we're not able to talk about indoor ag today, we're going to talk about some things that you can do at home, particularly if you don't have a backyard, you don't have a raised bed, you don't have ground to till up. You can do what I'm going to talk about today on your patio. You can do it anywhere. So we're going to talk about growing in containers. We're going to also talk a little bit about how to use food scraps to start plants. So I'm going to do this screen share here. There we go. And go there. There we go. So when we talk about container vegetable gardening, that's literally what we're talking about. Growing it in a container. You can grow it in anything. As you see, I have pictures of buckets, plastic buckets. You can use cans, you can use flower pots, you can use junk, whatever that you can get soil in. and that you can drain. So you got to put holes in whatever you use, put some holes in it so the water can drain out. You can grow something in it. The other good thing is that you can put this anywhere. If you live in an apartment and you have a patio, you see this picture, they're actually using the bars on the patio as the trellis. So you can grow anywhere. There's all types of containers you can use. We have the ceramic, we have the fabric. You can use plastic, use tubs. I've got one example. If you use those popcorn during the Christmas season, you can take those old cans and punch a couple holes in it to drain and turn this into a flower pot. Now you want to keep in mind that dark colors do create higher temperatures. So if you're dealing with dark color, like if you're using like the dark color fabric or a dark color container, make sure that you don't put it in the direct sun because it may get too hot and kill your seedlings, especially young roots. But they still work great, and put them in the shade or kind of mix them up in between your other light colored pots, and you can still grow anything. The other important part about growing in containers is fertilizer. As with all plants, you need to fertilize. They need light, water, and fertilizer. How much depends on what type of container you're using, what type of plant you're planting, and how big your container is. So generally, you want something, you want just a standard fertilizer, a good balanced mix like a 10-10-10 or a liquid fertilizer. Leafy greens that generally mature in 35 to 45 days, you may need to fertilize those several times because they really go through a lot of nitrogen. Your long season crops like your tomatoes and cucumbers, maybe every 2 weeks. And you know, doing it in a container, you may need to fertilize than you would in a garden bed or in the ground. Because as you water, your nutrients tend to leach out of the pot. Now you can recapture some of that by making sure that you use a pot that has, like your flower pots, you have a little capture at the bottom to hold the water. It will wick back in and through the soil. Let's see. What can you grow? Pretty much anything, particularly herbs, because you can grow herbs in your kitchen. They generally don't take a whole lot of soil. We'll actually get to that, but salad greens, peppers, tomatoes, beans, the most popular things, you can pretty much grow anything. And then feel free to experiment, because when we're doing it this way, it's a lot of experimentation. You can find some studies out there, but most of the studies are just experiments. Most of the things that I will be showing you today, I literally have been at just experimenting. I talk about taking anything. This is just stuff I had laying around. Like this was I don't even know what I was using it for. It was just a tub I found, and I cleaned it out, put some potting soil in it, planted peppers and tomatoes in it. I've got 5-gallon, I've got trash cans. Let's see if we can do that. I've got trash cans, I got buckets, got flower pots, I got all kind of stuff going on. I've got potatoes growing in trash cans. I've got beans growing in buckets. I even planted some mustard greens. I just took I don't even know what the thing was. It was just some piece of plastic that was able to hold soil, and I broadcasted my seeds just like you would in the garden, and they're growing just fine. It's a little cool. It's been real wet and real cool, so things are kind of slow right now, but they should take off. The thing you want to be cognizant of when you're using containers is just making sure that you have enough soil and enough depth for what you're growing. So if you're doing leafy greens, they generally only need 4 to 6 inches of soil. because they have shallow roots. If you're doing tomatoes, cabbage, you need at least 8 to 12 inches. So I recommend like at least a 1 to 3 gallon, a 5-gallon bucket for tomatoes, your beans and your cucumbers and things like that, because those roots need space to grow. Now I've got a bag here. Let's see if we can do this, where I just plant it directly in the bag. And that does fine too, as long as it's not in the direct sun, because it may get, that plastic will get hot, but it does great. I've done this several times over the years. Right now I've got some cucumbers in there. Generally you want a little bit more depth, but because the bag is long, they will spread just like they would in your garden bed, because most garden beds are no more than 8 to 12 inches deep anyway. So those roots will just kind of spread. And so they'll do the same thing in that bag. And so particularly for people who live in an apartment and you don't have any place to grow, you just go buy a bag of topsoil or potting soil. You can just cut you some slits in the bottom so the water will drain, and then just plant your plants directly in the top. You don't even need pots. But again, if you're planting in direct sun, you may need to watch that on using a bag, because it will get a little hot. The other thing to consider is watering. You want to water most plants in a container. You're going to need to water them daily. At least, if not daily, 2 to 3 times a week, depending on how dry they get. It depends on the material of your container, as well as what you're planting and the location. So you want to just take your finger and check that soil, stick it down in there. If it's moist, you're good. If it's dry, you want to make sure you water, because when you're using containers, that water is going to seep through that container and it's going to dry out a lot quicker. If you're using clay pots, they're going to dry out a lot quicker than it would with a plastic pot. So you just want to keep a check on your soil. Soil mixes, because I know this will be a question. A good soil mix for like this pot here, I took a 50-50 mix of potting soil and compost, and I got it at the Family Dollar. So it wasn't even expensive. I just mixed it up, works great. And then for fertilizer, what I generally do for my pots, I like to use the liquid fertilizer, like a Miracle Grow. In a hydroponic system, what we do out in Harding Street, we shy away from stuff like Miracle Grow because they have heavy metals, but in a container, it seeps through, it does great. If you ever used it in your garden or used it for your house plants, you know that it works wonderful. Pest, you notice our picture of pest. Just because you're doing containers, your plants are still going to attract the same types of pests. So your cutworms and your potato beetles, don't be surprised if you still see them on your patio, because they're coming after the crop. You won't see it as much depending on your location. Let's say if you're in an apartment, your pest pressure probably won't be as great as it would be if you were out in a field, out in a yard. But you need to keep an eye on it. Also, aphids and things like that, they still will become a problem. Also, when you're watering, make sure that you don't have too much water sitting around, because that attracts mosquitoes. It doesn't take but just a little bit of water sitting in your pot to attract mosquitoes. So you don't want to do that. All right, so I think I covered everything on that. Just, your basic light, water, and nutrients. That's what you need in order to grow in a container. And if you've ever grown house plants, it's the same as growing house plants. Same kind of care, except these you can eat. I get a lot of questions. I've gotten a lot of calls, especially during this COVID-19, about taking their food scraps and starting plants. And so I collect shot glasses. And so I use, between shot glasses and jars, you can start plants. So this is just your average potato. You can do this with any type of potato, including a sweet potato. You know, when you have a bag of potatoes and they're sitting in your pantry, they generally get eyes on them. They start to sprout anyway. Your potatoes and your onions will sprout on them. So it doesn't take a whole lot for them to get started. There are multiple ways to do it. This picture here is just, you know, submerging it in water. You could actually just cut the eyes off of it. Like a lot of farmers, they don't plant the whole potato, they cut the eyes off of the potato. And then you still can use the potato and then go plant the eyes. So you can do it that way. Take your onion, take the chips of your onion, put them in your shot glass, put a little bit of water, just let the roots get started. A lot of times you'll find your onions have already started to root. So you can just put those directly in water. But if they haven't started to root, if you put them in just a little bit of water in the shot glass, they will start to root fairly quickly. This is another shot of a potato. That's a sweet potato. Celery. It took me a couple of tries with celery, but I finally got it right. I was putting too much water. You don't need a whole lot of water. So if you take the tip of that piece of celery, put it in your shot glass and put just a tiny bit of water, that'll help it jumpstart. You can also, like, I know people, if you've used root stem to start plants and you don't have any root stem, you can take aspirin, because the chemical makeup of aspirin is that chemical is found in your root stem. So it works very well for starting the roots. We've done it at the center many times with cuttings. It's another onion. Now this one, pineapple. You know, as expensive as pineapple is, it is good to take that and reuse it and not throw it away. Very simple. Just stick it in a jar. It will start to root within a couple of days. And then all of your herbs, you can just take a cutting of your herbs, stick them in a jar of water. They will start to root within a couple of days. I've done this also with, I've taken garlic, pieces of garlic, stuck it in my shot glasses. I've taken apple seeds. I've been experimenting, especially during this time. I've actually got the apple seeds starting to root. Now, I'm not sure if they're going to actually grow, but they have started sprouting roots. So while you're in the house, experiment. Why not? Another thing I have found with your potatoes, if you have a couple of potatoes beginning to rot in the bag, take those, because you have to get those out the bag. Take those rotted potatoes and put those in a pot, plant them in the pot, they will grow. Stick them in your flower bed, they will start to grow. Now, when you grow potatoes, the best way to grow potatoes is to use like either a 5-gallon bucket or take a trash can. And as the plant starts to grow, once it gets about 6 inches, you want to start putting more dirt around it. And as it grows, you continue putting that dirt around it. And as it comes up out of the trash can, everything under it will grow potatoes. So it's very simple. It's, you know, growing food is very simple. I know we sometimes make it sound very complicated because we get into, at the academic level, we get into the chemical reactions and the fertilizer mixes for the most optimal, but for just growing food on your patio for you to eat is very simple. You can get a pack of seeds for $1 or $2. I went with plants because we're late in the season. But what we generally do with tomatoes and all of our plants, we start them from seed indoors, and then we move those out. But for right now, this is a wonderful time to experiment with just about anything. And I also want to talk, there's a lot of people out there that's doing this work. And so I want to give a couple of shout outs to Deron Chavis and folks in the Guilford Court Community Gardens. They're doing a lot of interesting work, teaching people how to grow food, looking at food as an asset. And it is something that you have to live. And so view your food as an asset and just grow food, grow as much food as you can. Instead of growing flowers, grow food. And so I think that's about all I have. So at this point, I will take questions.
We have a number of questions for
Okay.
Dr. Comer. The first question, we had a couple people wondering about if the plastic containers you plant plants in need to be food safe, and if you need to worry about things like BPA.
No, because as you're watering, most of that is gonna leach out anyway. Now, I wouldn't, use a container that had something toxic in it. You want to clean your containers out, but generally you're not going to have an issue with that.
Another question is if you're using a granular or a dry fertilizer instead of like a liquid like Miracle-Gro, when you apply it, should you water immediately afterwards?
Yes, and so you want to apply it right into the top. So let me see if I can. So let's see. So like if I wanted to fertilize, if I was getting ready to add some granular into this, I would just put it along the top, kind of maybe mix it in or not, but water it immediately. Because generally when you fertilize, if you don't water immediately, it can burn your plants up. Just like with your grass, if you've ever applied fertilizer to your lawn and you didn't water it, you kill your grass because it burns it up. So you want to water immediately. And some of the best fertilizer, go with a slow release. There's so many different types of fertilizer. I don't want to get into saying what's the best one. Slow release, 10-10-10. 10-10-10 is a good balance for multiple plants. And so instead of trying to figure out what type of fertilizer, how much nitrogen this plant needs, how much, phosphorus it needs, just go with a balanced fertilizer and you can't go wrong.
We have another couple questions about growing potatoes in containers.
Mm-hmm.
So one person is wondering, so you can grow potatoes just from regular grocery store potatoes. They don't need to be seed potatoes.
Sure.
Could you maybe just describe kind of what a seed potato is and what the difference is when you're buying them?
A seed potato is just a regular potato. It really, there's no difference. It's just a potato because the potato is the seed. So when a plant when a plant is procreating, what the fruit that we eat is generally the seed. So, when you cut open fruits, you see seeds in them. And then in some cases, like the potato is the seed.
And then another question about potatoes. So someone asks, I read that potatoes are a cool weather crop. Is it too late to plant them now?
No, it's not, particularly if you're doing containers, because you can control your temperature. If it gets too hot, then you take it in the house or you keep it in the shade. And so that's the other beauty of doing this, doing the container. You have more control over that. Just make sure that you still give it light.
And then another question about potatoes. Does the size of the container make a difference for potatoes? And do you have recommendations for potato container sizes?
Well, with potatoes, at least a 5-gallon bucket. So the more space you give it, the more potatoes you're going to get. So at least a 5-gallon bucket. or more. Because as it grows, if you continue adding soil to it, it's going to continue to grow.
Okay, another question about potatoes. So when people buy like fingerling or little tiny potatoes in the grocery store, can you describe kind of what those are with regard to large potatoes?
Fingerling potato, talking about the real skinny.
Like a mini potato.
There's, just like there's about 150 or more varieties of tomatoes, there's a whole lot of varieties of potatoes. So it just kind of depends on the variety. I can think of sweet potatoes. I can think of at least 6 different varieties that you find in the store. And so they all grow very similarly. They just have different tastes. It may be a little variation in the way they grow, but most of them grow about the same.
Okay, so some more questions about container sizes. Dr. Comer talked about that a little bit in the beginning of the presentation, and we do also have a container gardening publication that has some information on sizes. So I think
I can touch on that again. So if you're looking at your leafy greens, your shallow root stuff, you don't need much more than just a typical flower pot, 4 to 6 inches. This is a 10-inch pot, so I have a tomato in it. Tomatoes, you need at least 10, 12 or more. 5-gallon buckets do great for tomatoes, but a 10-inch would do a tomato just fine. But for shallow roots, no more, as long as 4 to 6 inches of depth is good. Cucumbers, tomatoes, and a couple other plants, cabbage, they need 12 inches or more. So you need a bigger pot. So 5-gallon buckets are always great. You can get those really, really big containers if you want to spend a little bit more money, or you can use what you have. I have a neighbor who is using an old wheelbarrow to grow vegetables in. We have I've seen cinder blocks. You take the cinder block, just put the soil in the cinder block, use that as your pot. So whatever you can use to hold soil that you can drain, that has good drainage, you can grow something in.
okay, we have another question, recommendations for if you have a very shaded spot, vegetables that will grow in the shade.
Shade, okay. There are several publications that have vegetables listed and how much sun that they need, and I would go by that. But because most vegetables you need sun. There are several that do well in shady areas. If it's always shaded versus light some of the day, like where I am today, this is shaded for most of the morning, but then in the afternoon it gets a whole lot of sun, and so things grow pretty decent out here. But you would have to, I would recommend looking at some of our publications where we have the vegetables listed and the amount of light that they take.
Yeah, I think that breaks down vegetables by the number of hours of light you get.
Right. So
I think it also recommends in there.
a lot of leafy greens need anywhere from like 4 to 6 hours, and your other things like tomatoes need up to 8 hours at least of sunlight. So it just depends on what you're growing, as well as sometimes with the variety. Some varieties take different amounts of light. And so we have publications that break down those crops as well as different varieties. And when you buy your seeds or when you buy your plants, it generally tells you on the back how much sun it needs. So you want to pay close attention to that.
Okay, what about if you have a maybe a shaded spot that gets shade for part of the day and then sun for a different part of the day? Would you recommend trying to move your pots to stay in the sun?
Yes, depending on what you're growing. that is another advantage of using pots. You can move them around. And so experiment with your space. If you start out in a space and they don't seem to be getting enough light, you can always move them.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. I think maybe we have time for 2 more. So a couple people wanted clarification on using the aspirin as a rooting hormone. So do you?
Yeah, so when you buy root stem, there's a long, complicated chemical name, but it is very similar to willow bark, which is very similar to what's in aspirin. And so aspirin does work as a root stem for most cuttings. So you just take your aspirin, crush it up, put it in, actually about a half of aspirin to a shot. So about a half of aspirin to an ounce is enough for a dip.
But just a regular aspirin, someone wanted
Just
to
a
know.
regular aspirin, yeah, not a extra strength or anything, just regular aspirin.
And then the last question here, are there any types of vegetables that you would definitely say you should not try to grow by either rooting when you bought in the grocery store or by saving seeds and growing from seeds that you got from a grocery store vegetable?
I really can't think of anything. They're not right offhand. I can't think of anything offhand. Most things you can reroot. Some hybrids, the seeds won't regrow, but that's why you have to experiment. If you know that you have a heirloom variety, it's generally going to grow. And then there's some foods that have been exposed to like radiation or something like that, but we've gotten away from most of that. Most people don't want that type of stuff, so those wouldn't grow. So I can't think of anything that I would say no to. It's always good to experiment.
That's great advice. So a couple questions about the publications. I will put links to the container gardening publication, and maybe if there are some other ones about shade gardening, I'll put links to those in the description to this video, and I'll try and go back through and answer any questions that we didn't get to, and put you in touch with your local extension office or your local master gardener group who can answer some of those more geographic specific questions. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Comer. That was a great presentation, and we hope that helps some people, some of you who don't have maybe the space to do a raised bed or are just getting started and don't want to have to go out in there and dig something up. There's still lots of options that you can do with limited space. So next Thursday, we're going to continue this series with Michelle Prisby of the Virginia Master Naturalist Program. And she's going to talk a little bit about gardening for wildlife and how you can incorporate plants that are good for you and can produce things that are edible for people to eat, and also create habitats and food for wildlife to eat. So there's lots of different components of gardening, and we're hoping that you're going to get exposed to and interested in all those different things. If you have any questions, I would like to remind everyone that's in the central and western part of the state, it's going to be a little cold this weekend. So if you have any questions about that or anything else, you can get in touch with your local Virginia Cooperative Extension Office, your local Master Gardener program, and they'll be able to offer more resources and help for you with that. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Comer, before we end the live stream?
I would say go to Pennhurst, and you can see some other great examples of people getting creative and mixing art in with their growing. So that is, if you're an artist, you can, again, use anything if it holds soil and can drain, you can grow something in it. So go check out Pennhurst. There's some wonderful ideas out there.
That sounds great. That's a great suggestion. Thank you so much, Dr. Comer. It was really great to have you. I'm going to go ahead and end the live stream now, and I'll go back through later and answer your questions.
Thank you.